Hey everyone, this is the Scholar General, Mo Jian Bing. So I have another extra special video for everybody today because I got a new sword. I got an LK Chen Song Hand Dao. Now, this is my first LK Chen blade and I'm super excited to, get to work and put it through its paces. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about like the history of this weapon, and then I'm going to review the particular one that I received and do some cutting. We'll start by talking about why is this called a Song Hand Dao, because in English that name doesn't exactly like flow off the tongue very easily, but basically in the Song Dynasty there was a military encyclopedia called the Wujing Zongyao, and in that encyclopedia they catalog a number of Dao, and there's 8 types of Dao. And it's important to remember that sometimes in English people will translate Dao to mean like knife or sword knife thing, kind of like the German Messer, but that's not exactly accurate, because in this military encyclopedia all like 7 of 8 of the Dao listed were actually polearms. So in Chinese the word Dao simply means single-edged blade. So a single-edged bladed polearm is also considered a Dao. And this was this type of, and the hand Dao is depicted in the encyclopedia is the one that you use with your hands. It's not a polearm. It's meant for like single-handed use. So that's why it's called the Song Hand Dao. Now the Song part comes from the Song Dynasty, which was from like 960 to 1279 AD. That's why it's called the Song Hand Dao. Now, let's start. Actually, I want to kind of start by talking a little bit about the scabbard, and then we'll work our way up from the pommel all the way up to the blade. So, the scabbard. Now, the scabbard here is pretty nice. I like the color and the aesthetic. But one interesting thing about this period and these swords is that we don't actually have any remaining scabbards that I know of. I haven't ever heard of them. Shou Dao, Song Shou Dao, like scabbard being excavated, or antiques passed down or anything. This is mostly a reconstruction on LK Chen's part, but because this is a single-handed weapon and it's meant to be used as a sidearm, it's not a primary battlefield weapon, they definitely had some kind of scabbard or something to hold the blade. Because if you're using like a bow or a polearm, you're not gonna hold the sword in your hand at the same time. So it makes sense that they would have some type of scabbard, and this one is basically about as simple as you can get. But that being said, it's also pretty nice for just being wood that's bound with cord. Now let's talk about the pommel. This is a ring pommel, which is became into vogue back during the Han Dynasty, which was about 1,000 or over 1,000 years before the Song Dynasty. But it remained popular, particularly on Dao. So that is why we see it still being used, even though there's arguments about what the Han Dynasty ring pommel would have been used for. There's like debates about what it could have meant, why they adopted it. Now, by the time of the Song Dynasty, LK Chen talks about this on his website, and I don't see any reason to disagree with him that it's mostly just there because it's a tradition that's been done before and they keep doing it. Eventually, during this time, there will be more variation, and after the Song Dynasty, the ring pommel starts to fall out of favor and changes forms and stuff like that. So this is kind of the last days of the ring pommel, as it were. Kind of. It does come back in a couple other forms later. But so let's move on to talk about the hilt, right? So this hilt is long enough to be used with 2 hands pretty easily for me. Like, I can easily put both hands on this thing. But this weapon in most cases is said to be a single-handed weapon. And in depictions it's also used single-handed, and there are some archaeological finds of Shou Dao like this that are completely single-handed, that don't have this extra long grip. Now the extra long grip is nice because it brings the center of balance. Let's see, the center of balance is about here, like 6.5 inches or 16.5 centimeters from the hilt. So if it didn't have a longer handle, it would start to, the center balance would start to, go more and more towards the tip, and that would mean it's harder to move. So having this longer grip helps with the balance, and I think that's primarily the reason that LK Chen decided to replicate an artifact that had a longer handle, because it does feel nice when you wave it around. Another important thing about the grip that you do not really notice in the images online is that this grip, it's an oval, right, which gives you kind of a feeling for the edge, but even more than that, it's actually not completely symmetrical. On the front of the oval and the back of the oval, you can't really see it when you look at it on the camera especially, but the curve here is much tighter than the curve in the back. So what that means is that I can feel where the edge is without having to look at the edge. It's very, very noticeable. It feels like it's biting into my hand when I hold it. When I hold it with the edge facing towards me, I can feel the grip biting into my hand, which that's extremely useful for indexing where your blade is, especially because this blade is unique in that the edge is here and not here. Most swords will curve back towards the back. This one kind of has a point that sticks out. So it's extremely valuable to have a grip where you can tell where the edge is without having to look at the point, because the point can mislead you. Now, as far as that being historical, most remaining artifacts do not have the handle scales still on. So this grip is like handle scales on the tang, and then it has wrapping around. Most remaining ones, are excavated ones, just have the metal. They don't have the wood and all that extra stuff. So I'm not sure if it's exactly historical, but it could be, and it's very useful either way. So now if we move up to look at the guard, you can see it has this interesting shape where it's not actually a disc. Like disc guards were common during the Ming and Qing dynasties, but this one has kind of a point to it and is rounded in the back, similar to actually how the handle is shaped. This type of guard is called like the peach-shaped guard, because it looks kind of like a peach pit. Sword guards in China started to grow, broader and evolve closer and closer to that rounded disc guard that we see in the Ming and Qing. And this is kind of represents a transition. It's quite small, right? It's not like sticking out pretty far like later examples might, but it's just one step in that process. Though I will say that during the Song Dynasty in particular is a time when sword guards in China were having a lot. There were many different kinds that were quite distinct, and it's kind of a major turning point in my opinion. It's a major turning point in the evolution towards the later Ming and Qing sword guards. And in the military encyclopedia, the Wu Jing Dong Yao, it actually records the Song Shou Dao, or the hand Dao, as having a 4-petal guard, which is like it's quadrilobed, or like 4 different lobes around, and that was another type of guard that was common during this period. Now let's move on to talk about this black like wrap that's over the blade, and this is called a Tunka in Chinese. And this is actually interesting because it's an imported feature from Central Asia. So I made another video where I talked about curved swords in China and how they got to China, and they came from like it's a Turco-Mongol saber is what it's usually called nowadays. So those had this like extra sheet wrapped around the blade towards the hilt, and that got imported into Chinese swords. Now there's no, not really any solid consensus on what the purpose of this is, but in my mind there's like 4 potential options. Number 1, it could be to protect the sword from weathering because it helps the sword fit more tightly in the scabbard. And this sword actually fits pretty tightly in the scabbard because it has this nice Tunka, and that will keep moisture and all types of things from getting into the scabbard and onto the blade, which will, rust the blade over time. So that's number 1. Number 2, it could be there to actually protect the scabbard from the blade. So if you have a nice sharp blade, this will kind of seat, the Tunka will seat the sword in the blade without actually cutting it as it moves through, as you're pulling it out initially. I'm not entirely sure or convinced by this argument, but it makes a degree of sense, especially if you're trying to yank or draw your sword extremely quickly into a cut. This could protect it, right? Now, another potential option is that this could be to protect it from other weapons. In swordsmanship, it's best to block an oncoming weapon with the fort, or the part of your blade that's closer to your hand, because you have more strength there and it's harder to push through and strike you if you block with this section of the blade. And this, because the edge is on this side and it sticks out quite far, there's a pretty good section of blade right there, it would protect it to an extent. It would protect the edge from receiving damage and would be a reinforcement on this part of the blade. And now the 4th thing that it could be is it could just be aesthetics. I mean, you can never rule out that people would have done something just because they liked how it looked. And that's totally true with this sword as well. It could just be that they liked how it looked, so they did it. The problem is the evidence. It's hard to find conclusive evidence for things like this and what this actually was for and why particular individuals over time chose to adopt new designs like this. But those are 4 potential possibilities. Moving on, let's talk about the blade, which is particularly interesting. As I mentioned before, the edge is actually on this side and not on this side. Now that strikes, at first, that seems counterintuitive and strange to most people, because most swords are the other way around, where the edge would be down here. But if we look at this sword is primarily designed to cut. The thrust is not really the point, pun intended, right? But the thrust is not really the purpose. It's almost exclusively cutting. The design has a pretty thick spine, and it has some mass, and the blade is actually thinner here and wider out here. So what that means is, mass is kind of being pushed a little bit this direction. Even though most swords, you're not supposed to cut with, you're supposed to find like a sweet spot somewhere in here, this sword will be able to cut, it should be able to cut pretty far out towards the tip, because the blade is still nice and kind of beefy out there. Another individual reviewed this blade, Aikidoka, who is like an amazing cutter, and he commented that this blade cut like as well as medieval European falchions and messers and stuff. So that's a real testament to its cutting ability, because those are like the best cutters in most people's minds. Some people might be off-put by the fact that this has no like point to stab with, but there are depictions of these hand dao that don't have as steep of a an edge here or a bevel here, so it does kind of scallop into more of a point, just like some messers. And it should note that in Europe there were also falchion designs that didn't have any kind of point or thrusting point to speak of. This blade is actually differentially tempered, which means that they put clay along it and then they quenched it, and there was no clay, or there was thinner clay on the edge, so that it cooled faster and it got harder than the spine, right? And that makes for a harder edge that's more resilient in terms of sharpness. The edge stays sharper for longer, right? One thing metallurgically that LK Chen swords, do, which is not completely historically accurate, is that they often will have folded blades, but they won't necessarily have laminated construction, which means that they don't necessarily have like softer iron section and a harder steel section wrapped around it or inserted into it, and these different types of laminations that existed in China. Now, early on in the Han Dynasty, these swords weren't really laminated, but towards the end of the Han Dynasty and up through the rest of Chinese history, most swords had a laminated construction. I can't really fault LK Chen because almost that would increase the price quite drastically, and it would make it much harder to produce, and it takes a lot longer. And even high-end European swords like Albion, they don't necessarily laminate or construct their swords in the traditional way either, because they will take a modern piece of steel and then temper it, but they won't necessarily get a softer iron core and wrap harder steel around it. But that is one thing that makes it not perfectly historically accurate. So I wanted to say that just because I'm kind of a super stickler for historical accuracy. But overall, I can't really blame him at all because it makes the sword stronger and more resilient, not as weak as medieval swords. Whenever we think about this sword in its historical context and how it would have been used during the Song Dynasty, there's a couple things I'd like to say. Number one, although it's called the Song Shou Dao or the Song Hand Dao, it was not exclusive to the Song Dynasty. We have depictions also from the Jin Dynasty in the north. It was the Jin and the Song were rivals, and there's also depictions of Jin Dynasty, carvings that show this type of blade. There's also this argument that this blade is designed to be anti-armor, an anti-armor weapon, and this is mostly due to the fact that the Song and the Jin wars and that time in East Asia in general, there was very, very heavy lamellar armor that was common. Many troops would wear it. However, Aikidoka and some other people are beginning to question this narrative, and I am as well. There's a few reasons why I think that this is probably not an anti-armor weapon. Number one is that the depictions that we have showing people wielding this, a lot of them are wearing armor, but that doesn't mean that they're striking people in armor. That's a distinction that's very important to make. So, I can wear whatever armor I want. The blade that I use shouldn't matter as much as who I'm trying to hit. And we don't see a whole lot of depictions of these being striking things and people and stuff. And if we showed some clear images of, this being used, in a fight with two armored individuals, I would love to see that, and that would give me a little bit of, pause for reconsideration. But as far as I know, that I haven't seen any, and just because these are used by someone wearing armor does not mean that they're meant to be used against armor. Another big reason that I think these are probably not an anti-armor weapon is because anti-armor weapons were extremely popular during this time period in China. They had heavy armor, and guess what? They also had, they had a lot of maces, like guduo, and they had all kinds of maces, and they had like what's called iron whips, which is like kind of like an S-stock, and also the jian, which is not the straight double-edged sword, but is basically a Chinese S-stock. And so they had these weapons that were already kind of like souped up or striking things, like bars that were pointed like a sword but not sharp, meant to be used against armor. And if they already have things like this, I don't see this thing, which is all about the edge, replacing those items or being able to compete with them. If we're both wearing heavy armor and I'm using this with this edge, and then someone else is using like the Jian, like the S-stock, I don't see how my weapon is gonna get to them and impact them the way theirs can hurt me, especially with their point and just the percussive power that they have over my own blade. Because of those reasons, I think that this is mostly meant to be used against people who aren't wearing as much armor. That being said, I do think that this sword is definitely more robust than many other blades that Chen has produced before, because a lot of the Han Dynasty weapons can be longer and thinner blades, which is great for reach and fighting, but is not necessarily meant for, being extremely rugged when doing heavy cutting against heavy targets. I do think that perhaps this could be used quite effectively against leather armor, leather lamellar, as well as, types of padded armor. But I don't see this going through, iron or steel lamellar. Alright, so now let's talk about the fit and finish of this particular sword that I received from Chen. So first of all, start with the blade, the most important part. It is completely straight, and the edge is perfectly straight, so no complaints there. It handles quite well. I will say that the one that I received is actually 100 grams heavier than the specifications listed on Chen's website, which isn't inconsequential. 100 grams is 100 grams, but that being said, I actually still think it handles quite nicely, so no, I don't have any complaints about that. Aikidoka, and in the past other people have talked about the black paint that is used on the fittings on Chen swords, and that it has a tendency to come off. And I will say that I haven't cut or done any actual testing with this at all. I just kind of moved it around, and I will notice that the paint is already starting to wear off very, very slightly, like on the Tunka from extracting the blade from the scabbard, and also I can see a little bit of wear on the paint on the discard. You guys probably can't see that, but so the paint is not the most resilient. Ideally, I don't really mind if it does, become steel over time, or change color into steel over time, but because it's advertised as being black, it shouldn't be wearing off this quickly. Something probably should be done with it. Overall, what matters most is the tightness of the fittings and the blade and the movement, and I don't have any complaints as far as that goes. And so if it's just something that's aesthetic, I don't really mind, because kind of, in my view, kind of the appeal of this sword is just kind of the, the brutal directness and no nonsense nature of it. And if it gets some, wearing and some scratches on the paint, it's not really a big deal, because, it's just meant to cut things really well. And if it cuts things well, that's great. It's pretty sharp. It's definitely sharper than other makers like Windlass or something. But another good thing is that the edge geometry is a very long bevel, and it's a gradual taper towards the edge, so that makes it a pretty good cutter if you're skilled. We'll see if I'm a good cutter. So yeah, let's get to cutting. Alright guys, so as you can see, the Song Handao definitely cuts bottles. It's nice and sharp. And if you go and look at Aikidoka's review, you can see him cutting like double rolled tatami and like cutting tatami wrapped with linen and all this other stuff. So it really shows how the cutting prowess of this weapon. This thing is lots of fun. It cuts well, it's interesting history, and it looks nice. And you know, I just, yeah, top remarks. I mean, because it's me, I would like love to have like a jiagang or like sanmei, like laminated construction, but that's not really in this price point because this only goes for like $400 or so. Highly recommended. Alright, I'll see you guys next time.